Hi there, I thought I'd share a video reflection on the scripture readings that are being suggested for churches to look at this Sunday. The first reading is from the book of Exodus chapter 32, verse 1 to 14. And the second reading is from Matthew's Gospel chapter 22, verse 1 to 14. So feel free to pause the video and have a read of those and then start the video up again. I think when reflecting on these readings at the moment, it's important to be recognizing the context in which we're hearing those stories. Yesterday on this continent, we had a referendum on whether we should change the Constitution of Australia to recognise First Peoples by establishing an Indigenous body that would advise the government on things that most impact Indigenous people. And it was a question about how we choose to live together as First Peoples and as colonist migrant peoples like myself in these lands. Do we want to continue to learn to walk together and learn to listen, or do we want to give up and say that it's too hard? My church, the Uniting Church, decided that we would support this change because the Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress asked us for our support on this years ago. Because we've already agreed we'll walk with them, we said yes. At the same time, this week, we've been shocked by an attack that seemed to come out of nowhere. Kidnapping and killing of civilians. And we've heard of retaliation from the state of Israel. We've heard of the killing of Palestinian people, flattening of homes, schools, hospitals. We've seen Israel cut off Gaza's supplies of water, food, electricity and communication. And we've been reminded that the initial attack did not come out of nowhere, but it was a response to the daily violence of Israel against Palestine, violence that we don't hear about in the media. Israel controls Palestine, and Israel is overwhelmingly in control of this situation, gradually squeezing Palestine into smaller and smaller separated areas of land until Israel chokes Palestine or Palestine explodes. The state of Israel, with the greater power and the greater control over the land, has the greater power to set the conditions of conflict. The Israeli state has decided they will not learn to walk together. They'll not learn to listen to each other. They'll not learn how they can exist together in the land. We grieve all of the violence, suffering, and death. This is the context we're in when we hear from the scriptures today. We've just been asked if we want to listen to the First Peoples of this place, and we've been hearing in the news about war in Gaza. Last Sunday, you might have heard about God making an agreement with the ancient people of Israel about how they would live together, how the people would relate to God, and how they would treat each other. In today's reading, the story continues, and Moses has been up the mountain with God for a long time, 40 days and 40 nights, while God has been giving Moses instructions for the building and operation of a tabernacle, a big tent that'll be home to God as they travel about the land, and the place where worship ceremonies will happen. But during those 40 days, while God is talking to Moses about the sanctuary tent, the people become discouraged. One of the things that God had told them as part of this new way of life that they were agreeing to was that they should not make idols. And this is different to what was practiced in Egypt, the place they'd come from, and in other neighbouring countries, because gods would be represented with impressive sculptures and statues to inspire worship and devotion. In the wilderness with this new God, the God of their ancestors, they've had the pillar of fire and cloud to remind them of God's leadership, and they've had God's messenger Moses with them, so they have not needed sculptures or statues to remind them of God's presence. But now God and Moses have been away up the mountain for over a month, and the people must be wondering, will they come back? Have they deserted us? And they ask Moses' brother Aaron to make gods for them because they don't think Moses is coming back at this stage. They fear that they've been deserted and they need reassurance. One of the things with idols is that they're made by us and controlled by us. And if we're the ones in control of the idols, we can stop others from accessing them. Aaron uses his skills to make a golden statue in the shape of a bull, an image of God that's concrete, hard and shiny, symbolizing strength, virility, agricultural wealth. And he says to the people, these are the gods that brought you out of slavery. And when he says gods, he's saying Elohim, which is also a name that's used for the one God of Israel. And he says that they're going to have a festival in honor of the God of Israel. And they offer sacrifices and celebrate. It sounds as though what is going on is that Aaron is presenting the golden bull statue as a representation of God, as a representation of the one God who's led them out of slavery. I've noted in earlier weeks that God was not angry with the people at other times when they complained because they were afraid for their lives, because they were being chased down by their enemies, when they complained because they thought they could die of thirst, when they complained because they didn't know where they were going to find food in the desert. God has had compassion on them and has protected them and provided for them. But when this happens, when the people make an idol to represent God and to use in worship, this is when God is enraged in the story. They've tried to contain God in an image that they have imagined and in a form that they control. They've tried to domesticate and master God. They've tried to trap God in a hard concrete form. And I think this is what makes God mad. God expresses a desire to destroy them. In this story, God is being presented as very human, I think, reacting with strong emotion when the people try to control God. We might find it hard to accept a God who expresses these emotions. But the thing is, God doesn't act out the violence in this story. God expresses the desire to destroy in anger. Moses hears it, and Moses talks God out of it. Once God has expressed it and heard Moses' response, God chills out and returns to being patient and compassionate and merciful. It isn't included in the lectionary, but after this, it's Moses who does not express his anger to God, but who returns to the people and enacts violence on them and stirs up violence among them, creating more grief and suffering. He hasn't been instructed by God to do this. God has turned away from that response, but Moses has embraced the response of violence. If only Moses had talked to God, maybe God would have talked him down too. We also have a disturbing and violent story in the parable. Parables have often been treated like they're allegorical, like, for example, John Bunyan's Puritan novel, The Pilgrim's Progress, or like C.S. Lewis's modern fantasy novels, The Chronicles of Narnia, where all the details in the story actually symbolize something different, something theological. But parables actually aren't allegories. They're actually, I think, a little bit more like riddles that confuse us and challenge our thinking. Because the story starts off sounding like the familiar kind of story, but it goes somewhere we don't expect, often somewhere shocking. Jesus says that this parable shows what the reign of God or the kingdom of God is like. And if we're used to thinking of parables as allegorical, we might presume that the king's actions in this story tell us about what God is like. The thing is, Jesus doesn't tell us where in the story we'll see something that is like the reign of God. Folks have often presumed that it must be the king who is like the reign of God, but we might just as easily ask, could it be the people who refused to come to the party who are like the reign of God, the people who rebelled against the king? Could it be that they have good reason not to want to come to the wedding banquet? Could it be that he is a king who has treated them badly? The people Jesus was telling this story to had certainly been ruled by cruel and violent kings. The king confirms this possibility by doing something that is very similar to what we've witnessed in the news this week. In response to their rebellion, which is a violent rebellion, he sends in his soldiers to kill them and flatten their city, to eliminate them completely. On the other hand, could it be that it's the fellow at the end of the parable who turns up but is not celebrating, not dressed appropriately? Could it be that this is the person who is like the reign of God? He's seen how he'll be treated if he refuses the invitation, so he has turned up, but he's not going to pretend that he's enjoying it. And that guest finds himself thrown out of the party into the place of grief, perhaps the place inhabited by those who grieve the king's violence, whose city has been eliminated. I think that is the place where we find the reign of God. My partner and I were telling this story to her son in the car yesterday because he'd asked for a Bible story. And when we tell the Bible stories in this kind of situation in the car, everybody contributes to the story, and often the story, like a parable, goes in an unexpected direction because it's collaborative. Yesterday's version of the story was interrupted by a loud honk from my partner's son, and so the story ended up going that a rude guest started honking all through the banquet to the point where the king kicked him out. But that honking guest started a honking party with all the other folks who were outside the party. And the guests who were inside started hearing all the honking from outside and thought that sounded like it was really the place to be. That sounded like where the real event was happening. And so they headed outside to join in the honking, and eventually even the king left his own party to join everybody outside. During the week, the main story in the news has been the violence inflicted by Hamas on Israeli citizens and the devastating retaliation from Israel. But I also saw videos of Hasidic Jewish communities protesting the attacks on Palestinians, waving Palestinian flags in solidarity and pushing police out of their neighborhoods when police tried to shut down their protests. Yesterday, in this colony, we were asked about whether we as a society wanted to sit at the table and listen to the first peoples of this land. Adam Briggs, in the lead-ups to the referendum, was saying, "We're giving you permission to listen." Across the country, a majority of people said no, we don't want to listen. We don't want them to have a place at the table. But we still have the opportunity to listen to First Peoples, just like we did yesterday. Millions of us said yesterday that was what we wanted. Maybe we should go and sit with them and listen, even if it's outside the main event, and plan what we work on next.